Well, good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar focused on the August 27th Proposition 105 election in Phoenix, which brought to question the regional rail system and many benefits. I'm Paul Spitalis, President and CEO of APTA, the American Public Transportation Association. And this afternoon, we're going to hear from Phoenix Mayor Kate Gallego and Tony Connie about their experiences in the campaign. And we're here to help recognize the mayor's leadership as a champion for the mobility, environmental, and economic needs of the Phoenix community. Please note that our conversation today will be off the record. We want good, candid exchange. Today's webinar is part of many webinar offerings that are available through APTA and what we call APTA U, which brings together our educational offerings. You can check the schedule of previous and upcoming webinars at APTA U on the APTA website. Over the past 15 years, voters around the country have consistently and decisively acted to support public transportation investments in their community. This chart shows vote results year after year to be consistently above 70%. I would ask, what could be more reflective of public sentiment for public transportation than just that? A better than 70% passage rate, people voting for public transportation investments. I want to call your attention to some of the resources that are available to you through APTA's Center for Transportation Excellence. CFT, as it is called, serves as a clearinghouse for transit campaign messages and strategies. CFTE has the campaign expertise to help address many of the pre-campaign issues that communities may face and to connect them with the resources that are relevant to their endeavor. CFTE maintains data on all transit elections, past, present, and future, and it can provide the facts and statistics to help respond to the well-funded, organized opposition groups such as Phoenix faced in its election just this past Tuesday. In a related item, let me mention to you that there's an upcoming Transit Initiatives and Communities workshop that you'll want to put on your calendar. Every 2 years, APTA convenes this workshop on transit elections, bringing together public officials, business leaders, and campaign professionals who have been through recent elections to share their experiences on the messages, strategies, and tactics that made the difference. The workshop this year will be held December 15th through the 17th in Tampa, Florida, which had a successful transit ballot measure just last year in 2018. You can be assured that very practical, useful, and relevant information will be presented and shared, and certainly including the information from the Phoenix experience. Before I introduce the mayor, I want to show a few quick images which Mayor Gallego may choose to elaborate on. This slide shows the Valley Metro Light Rail system serving the city of Phoenix and adjoining communities such as the cities of Mesa and Tempe. This is another look at the Valley Metro Light Rail system as it exists today, 2019, compared to what it will be in 2024 as rail development continues. Proposition 105, of course, would have put all of this in great jeopardy. In fact, it would have ended all light rail development and construction in Phoenix. What you see here is the language that was on the ballot. I think you'd agree, relatively complex and hard for voters perhaps to understand. Supporters of Phoenix Light Rail had to vote no. Mayor Gallego may choose to comment on this further, and I'm sure she will in her remarks and presentation. Now we're at the moment we've been waiting for. Fresh off her big victory, it's my pleasure to introduce Phoenix Mayor Kate Gallego. Mayor, we know that as a champion for public transportation and the economic benefits and access to opportunities it enables, you've been a real champion for your city. While serving on city council prior to her election as mayor, she championed the 2015 campaign to pass Phoenix's citywide transportation plan that funded new light rail routes, expanded bus service, street repavements, and transit infrastructure improvements. In March 2019, she became the second elected female mayor in Phoenix history and the youngest big city mayor in the United States. With Mayor Gallego today is Tony Connie. Tony's the general consultant for the Invest in Phoenix campaign and currently a vice president for Resolute Consulting. Tony also managed Mayor Gallego's successful mayoral election earlier this year. Please note that after the opening remarks, we will open the floor for your questions submitted to the question box. Use the question box found on your screen to submit your questions. We will pose as many questions as possible during the Q&A segment of the webinar. So now it's my great pleasure to turn things over to Mayor Gallego and to Tony Connie. Mayor, please tell us how you pulled off what you did.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you to the APTA community for convening with us today, and more importantly, for your help on this campaign. APTA has been with us from the start of transit in Phoenix. The Center for Transportation Excellence helped us with Transit 2000 about 2 decades ago when we first began this program. I think we were one of your early success stories, and we appreciate your help as well as we kicked off this campaign. I am a very new mayor. I'm at about 5 months as mayor, and this campaign began really before my election. So folks like Josh Cohn with the Center for Transportation Excellence have been there from before the official beginning of the campaign, and we've been grateful to have your research on a variety of topics, including working with a more conservative electorate. Phoenix is a purple city. We have in our campaign when you talked about our campaign in 2015, which was our citywide transportation campaign that included tripling the light rail. That was a campaign in which we had more Republicans voting than Democrats. So I hope Phoenix is a good piece of evidence that people support transit across party lines. And we saw that again with this week's campaigns. We won by a significantly large enough margin that we feel comfortable saying we had support from people of all demographics and parties. And that is something we need to be talking about in America, that we have bipartisan support for infrastructure, which are investments that are key to make. A little bit about us in Phoenix. So we are the 5th largest city in the United States, 1.7 million people. We have more people in the city of Phoenix than about 10 states have in their entire state. We are also the fastest growing city in the country. We added more people than any other city in the country last year, and we are becoming increasingly urban. This vote may be the key milestone when we tell that story, though. Voters said overwhelmingly we want to have a strong urban transportation system with light rail. We've had 2 elections in the last 5 years focused on transportation, and it's been interesting for us to reflect on some of the differences and some of the similarities. We had a much larger margin with just light rail.
You can go to the next slide, if you could.
So we see Proposition 104, which was on the ballot in 2015. That was a citywide transportation plan, streets, sidewalks, bus, rail, and then Prop 105, which we just completed this week in 2019, light rail only. So you can see light rail only won by a much larger margin, although we are proud of both victories. Was honored as a council member to chair Proposition 104 in 2015, and then I got to work with 2 incredible council members who co-chaired this campaign. In 2015, we had the light rail and transportation system on the ballot with multiple city council elections and a mayoral election. In 2019, it was only 2 propositions, one related to a spending limit on the city and one related to the light rail, so no candidates on the ballot. And exciting news for us, we had hit in terms of elections that were only city, we have hit our highest turnout record ever with this election. We believe it was driven by people who wanted to vote in support of the light rail. I'm trying not to take it personally, but more people voted in this election than the mayoral election. But I think that's a strong sign of how important these issues are to our community. And it has been wonderful for us to be able to tell the rest of the country that we do care about our transit system, about the equity and sustainability that come along with it. It's been a real point of pride for our community. We've gotten several pieces of national coverage saying that, while other communities have been going in a different direction on transit, Phoenix has made a strong commitment, and that's a point of pride for me as a new mayor and as someone who loves this city. It's also personally important to me. I don't know if people are familiar with my story, but shortly after being elected to city council, I had a seizure. And in Arizona, that means you lose your driver's license for several months. So it's not what you want to be known for when you're starting your life as a elected official. I got more coverage for having a seizure than I did for winning my election. But it was a really important experience for me. In the parts of our city with a strong transit system, it was easy to get around and a great experience. But not in every part of our city. I live on the southern portion of our city, which does not yet have light rail, but will be the first to get it after this election. And so I've always tried to really be a strong proponent for making sure people have a chance to get around our city, regardless of the mode of transportation they are using. So this is an exciting milestone for me personally. And it's been just a wonderful experience. We've had Resolute Consulting and Tony serving as our general consultant, but a really broad group of stakeholders from our Chamber of Commerce to our unions to folks like AARP who've come on board. It really makes me proud to see how much this entire community cares about our system and was willing to step up. I think we're one of the few communities where AARP has really closely partnered with an initiative, but they want their members to be able to age in place, and they know that transit is the linchpin for that. So we've had really strong stakeholders. We have had a very impressive group of young people who knocked on doors in Phoenix, which is a real commitment in the summer. It's been one of our hottest summers on record, and young people were out there talking about the importance of turning out the vote, which we think is a big reason as well why turnout is so high. There's nothing like talking about sustainability in the middle of Phoenix's summer heat, and that has motivated people as well. So we are very, very excited about, and maybe I'll pause for a moment and turn it over to, and we've just gotten to, we have a beautiful front page in our newspaper today. You can see now on your screen our top of the fold headline today, Nation Takes Note as Phoenix Votes, and highlighting our great light rail system. One thing that has been really remarkable in this campaign is how much national and international attention the campaign has received, and I think it's been very positive for the city of Phoenix for us to make such a strong commitment to light rail. But we did really get attention, and APTA has been a great partner in helping us tell the Phoenix story. There were a lot of things that were new to us this campaign from previous transit campaigns. We've never had a Netflix comedy special that talked about the importance of transit. But I think the whole country is watching, and in our case, we consider that very much good news. And now with that, I will turn it over to Tony, our general consultant.
All right, thank you, Mayor Gallego. I want to talk, this obviously we are right off the election. Votes are still being counted. That's how many people voted in this past election. And we're really excited to tell the story of how, we were able to pull this off and protect light rail here in Phoenix. And so what you have in front of you right now is what was in the Arizona Republic this morning, which is, to some extent, our local paper, put this up there, and the coverage in some ways is sort of a shock. How did they manage to win this initiative by getting people to vote no by such huge margins? And if you go to the next slide, you'll see where we came from. There was an article that appeared in the Republic, and I'm now looking at the date, and I wondered to myself why I hadn't read this article before, but that's actually the date that the mayor was elected to mayor.
That day.
So, that got a lot of play, which is like, hey, here's why this time the fourth vote that's going to be happening in Phoenix in 2 decades on light rail, why we might actually lose. And And the opinion piece here, which is written by one of the gentlemen who's on the editorial board in Phoenix, he says exactly how he felt, which is that it's not a foregone conclusion that light rail is going to stay. And part of the challenge was that we faced what I know many of you face every day, which is an ongoing, persistent investment from transit opponents, working behind the scenes, working publicly, working through various means to get as many myths and as many messages out there about why public transit, and particularly rail transit, is a waste in a community like ours. So as we heard at the top, there were actually signatures that were collected by paid signature gatherers to put Prop 105 on the ballot. And at the same time, thinking that it would be helpful, some of the folks who were in favor of Prop 105 also put a second proposition on the ballot, which is Prop 106. And if you go to the next slide, you can see a little bit about that. And Prop 106 was about capping the amount of money that the city could spend. I'm not going to get too into detail about it, but it really was an investment cap that was masquerading as pension reform. And so the idea was, not a lot of people are going to vote in this upcoming election. Let's throw both of these things together so we can take advantage of the situation, and we can get to, for them, yeses, which would have been a huge win, for opponents of transit. And so we made the decision to link these two campaigns together, and it was a tough one. We decided, you know what, does it make sense to go out there and try and communicate that people should be voting no on both of these? And I'll get into more detail about that in a minute. But we ran a joint effort where we communicated about how these need to be stopped at the same time together. And so we framed this as a coordinated attack on Phoenix's future. It has the benefit of being true, and that it really would tie the hands of our leaders and cut services and kill smart investments in our city's future. And so we walked into a situation where light rail really was under attack. It was genuinely threatened. And we, through research, were able to determine, though, a couple of things. One of those things was that light rail was actually pretty popular in Phoenix. That's one of those things that you would not really know if you watched city council meetings or you read local news coverage, because often, the people who were investing and trying to tear down transit in Phoenix over the last, particularly the last decade, often win the news story, and they get a coverage about some of the challenges or increasing costs or all those kinds of things. But our research showed something that I think a lot of people were surprised by, which is, hey, you know what? People in this city really like light rail. And so we made the decision early on, which is something that, frankly, a lot of people disagreed on, that this campaign wasn't going to be a branding campaign about light rail. Instead, we were going to be talking about how light rail was under attack. We were going to assume that people in Phoenix appreciated and liked light rail, because that's what our research showed us. And we were going to try to motivate the people who supported rail to go out there and vote. And we were going to try and convince the people who weren't so sure whether or not these extensions made sense to understand why it was essential to spread opportunity to go out there and cast their ballots to defeat Prop 105. We knew, though, that it was a huge undertaking, considering the time that this election was going to be taking place, in the summer when there was nothing else on the ballot. And so if you go to the next slide, the mayor led an effort to build a massive coalition to oppose both 105 and 106, which took a tremendous amount of education, a lot of work, and a lot of leadership. And managing these folks, I will tell you, was a joy. It also was extraordinarily difficult, because at a quick glance, you might see that there's a lot of people who joined together on this effort and really leaned in order to help us get people to vote no, who don't work together very often. We were able to build a coalition not only of political opponents, people who'd run against each other before, or people who weren't always on the same page, or different political parties, but we also had business leaders and labor leaders who came together and worked together. We also were able to get neighborhood groups and elected officials, not that they are against each other all the time or any of the time, but you know, the AARP, you know, who typically haven't engaged in this type of race, they really leaned in very heavily on this, and we built our campaign around finding opportunities for all of these groups to speak to their individual members, to serve as validators about how important defeating Prop 105 was. But we also really wanted people to be very, very disciplined and stick to a message, because one of the lessons that we took away from previous efforts was that, and no offense to all my transit friends who are on the phone, but people want to make transit everything for everybody. And sometimes that messaging gets very, very confusing, especially in an election where we had to convince people who had previously voted 3 times yes for light rail that they had to vote no in order to protect light rail. And so we needed to stick to our message. And so one of the things I'm so proud of on this campaign, and I think that the fact that the mayor and the chairs of this committee really empowered us to do this, and all of our coalition members played this role, is we weren't willing to accept conventional wisdom as fact. And we wanted to really make sure that we were running a research-based campaign that was talking to the right people, that was using the right messaging, and that would actually get us to a big win, because we wanted a really, really big win here to help silence some of these things. So let's go to the next slide, and I'm going to talk a little bit. This is maybe a little bit too snarky. I didn't show the mayor this before I put it up. So research beats conventional wisdom. So what we have here on the side is there's a tweet from July of the end of July. Our voting in Arizona happens over the course of the month of August. The people, 85 to 90% of people will vote early. And you'll see here that this is one of the primary strategists on the other side, and he tweeted out that summer election in Phoenix, barely 10,000 people will vote. So if conservative-leaning voters simply turn in our ballots, we win. I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt. I think that he meant to include an extra 0 in that 10,000. And so we'll just make that assumption right now for him, because he's a pretty smart guy. And so that really was the conventional wisdom, though, not the 10,000 part, but the fact that turnout would be very low. That's an assumption that I had. It's an assumption that we all had. We sat down and we thought, this is going to be coming out of nowhere for people. A lot of folks aren't going to vote. But we weren't willing to accept that as fact, and we did research. We commissioned a predictive model to try and figure out where our turnout would be. And our predictive model, our research said there's going to be 181,000 votes. When that first came across, and Josh from the Center for Transportation Excellence will tell you, we really were like, this is nuts. There's no way this is right. I can't believe this. But we put our campaign plan together and we put our faith in the research. And we said, you know what? We need to spend as though this is true. And it turns out it was accurate. We think our efforts helped build turnout beyond what would have been expected if we did nothing. And we got turnout up to 195,000 votes. And so let's go to the next slide as I make a point about research versus conventional wisdom. And so the second thing he says in here is that if Republicans vote, we're going to win. And I know that that's a common assumption when it comes to rail, but through our research and the modeling that we did and our polling, we firmly believed that up to 40% of the Republican voters in our city were winnable in this election. And based on the results, maybe even more than that. And so we did not do targeting in this election based on some of the regular things that campaigns do targeting based on. We didn't assume that only people who voted in city elections were going to vote in the city election. We didn't assume that you could bundle together the folks who live in particular neighborhoods that tend to be more Republican than others and treat them one way or another. And so as a result, we really talked to people based on our model to get them to vote, and we had messaging that was targeted to them. And so the result of this, of really our willingness to put some of those conventional bits of information aside to build trust with coalition partners who typically haven't worked together, to get everybody to stay very focused on message, and to not make this campaign an outright branding campaign about why light rail is important, and to sort of trust our research, got us where we are today, which is an election result that we haven't been able to do the analysis yet because the total canvas isn't out, but it looks like I would be shocked if we didn't win in every single council district, if we didn't win big along where these routes are going to be extended. And we feel really good about what we did. So I think I was supposed to talk for just a couple minutes. I went too long. And so those are the main points I wanted to make to start. And I know now that we have an opportunity for questions, and so I wanted to step out and let everybody get to that part.
And maybe one more thank you from me. It really has been wonderful that this has been a national effort. We've had transit CEOs come in and talk about their experience. Most recently, Phil Washington came in from Metro in Los Angeles. We have had mayors from all over the country who've stepped up. Phoenix is the largest city in our area, but we are surrounded by a bunch of great partners, and their elected officials were willing to talk about why this mattered for our entire region. So that's been a really gratifying thing, and I think APTA is the key convener for helping bring people together. So for those of you who are either facing something similar, I would definitely lean on APTA, and we know we have to pay back. So if we can be helpful, we would love to help other communities that have transit on your ballot.
Mayor and Tony, thank you very much. That was an excellent primer here in terms of what transpired. But we've got some questions for you, and I'd like to lead it off, if I may, Mayor, with a question to you. And that is, can you talk a little bit more about what you may have learned from your experiences on Prop 104 in the campaign in 2014? What was it about that campaign that perhaps informed and gave you all some ideas about how you might apply it to the most recent campaign here in this victory? Any thoughts around that?
With Proposition 104, we learned that broad stakeholders are very helpful, and that you really need to get outside the traditional engineering firms, general contractors, but you want to bring as many groups as possible. So that was when AARP first got involved with us, and they were powerful spokespeople. We worked a lot with our school system. Education is very important to voters in Phoenix. Our big high school district is called the Phoenix Union High School District, and they have gotten great remarks from their auditors for spending so little on transportation. They use our Valley Metro system, and so that's more dollars that they can keep in their classroom for important issues like teacher pay. And their students were willing to share stories with us, which was very powerful, hearing from people what the system has meant for them, talking to people who used to have a much more difficult commute, and what they've been able to do with the additional time to study and be involved in extracurriculars. We tried hard to put good faces on the campaign about what this means. So that was something that was very important. We also learned that it was very important for elected officials to be directly involved. A lot of the business and labor leaders wanted to hear directly from us. And so that was one of the reasons I decided to have 2 council members as co-chairs, in addition to being very involved myself. And I think people really wanted to see commitment directly from the mayor. My predecessor, Greg Stanton, put our transportation expansion on the ballot while he was on the ballot for re-election, which was a courageous thing to do. When I gave my first State of the City speech, my focus was on the light rail system and what this election meant. And I would say that was also a key milestone in this campaign. it sent a message that I was all in. This was very important to me and the city, and particularly with our business community and our advocacy groups. I think that was a turning point for them, where they said, we have to be involved. Light rail is not maybe our core, but it is how our people get around, and it is key to the future of Phoenix, and they wanted to partner with us.
Tony, if I may direct a question to you, and you touched on this in some of your remarks here, but I wonder if you might be able to elaborate a bit, and that's this issue of this joint campaign that you decided to run against Prop 105 and 106, kind of having a double barrel pointed at you. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of what went through your head about how to approach that? Because I think there'd be some lessons learned there for others as they think about, how they can perhaps meet a similar challenge like that in their own measures. So any additional info you can share on that count?
Yeah, I think that was it was a really hard decision. And we knew that there would be efficiencies that came with us running these campaigns together. We knew that they would be coordinating with one another to some extent, and potentially even very greatly. But we didn't want to make the decision to run a joint campaign just based on a gut feeling that it would save us money or that would help. In fact, just to be very honest, going into it, I felt like it might not work. I was very worried that the two messages might be confusing for people if we put them together, and that it might be a real challenge to, convince people on one side to vote no. And many of the people who I respect greatly in this space were worried that Prop 106, which is the spending cap, might pull down Prop 105 and might hurt the effort. And so before we made the decision, we knew that we had to do research and that our assumptions are things that we needed to put aside. And we really dug into that. And then we extrapolated based on our findings a few things. And so one thing that came out of the research was that talking about the future of light rail and the future of transportation wasn't as compelling to voters as I think we had expected. The bigger, broad picture message of, world-class cities have transportation options or that kind of stuff didn't, because many of these people were like, yeah, I got it. I'm on board with that. The question is, why should we extend the system, blah, blah, blah. Why should we vote no? And we knew from the research, though, that framing this as an attack that was happening now about the urgency of the moment was important. Because one, we had to motivate people to vote no, because it was a hard thing to convince people what a no vote was. And we saw that some of the messaging on the urgency of the attacks on 106 was stronger than it was for 105. And we felt that there was a common connective thread about the sort of outsiders coming in and trying to dictate to a popular city council and a popular mayor how they should run the city. And so we combined them together. And it was a gamble based on research, and it really did pay off, because it helped amp up the immediacy of the attack that we were facing in Phoenix in a way that I think if we had run these separately, that we wouldn't have done it. At the end of the campaign, there were so many undecideds on that 106 when we first did our polling. It was the one that had the highest likelihood of passing, we felt. And at the end of the campaign, we started to notice for our field contacts, which, by the way, we had a massive, massive effort. We identified almost 40,000 voters on how they were going to vote, which is unbelievable, which was done through a partnership with labor groups and a bunch of volunteer groups. But we started to notice that people were telling us that they were voting yes on 105 and no on 106. And I panicked. And I was like, oh my gosh, what's happening? Are we losing people? And it turns out it was the opposite. What happened was we were gaining people on 106 that we didn't think we were going to get. And in conversations at the door, when you connected these things together, people really got what we were facing, and they wanted to basically say enough is enough. And so running these together jointly ended up being something that worked really well. And I think a lesson from that is like really challenge your assumptions, be willing to push back against even your own feelings and some of the things that, you know, some of the stakeholders may hold true, and make decisions based on research. And the fact that the committee chairs, in particular the mayor, had enough faith and trust in our campaign leadership to make that decision and to walk them through everything really is essential. And I think it is a major reason why we won by such a big margin.
Excellent. Let me pose a question again to each of you. You touched on your early remarks the conservative vote, the Republican voters, and of course that's a big issue I think around the country. How do we win over larger percentages of the Republican vote and the conservative vote? Could you comment a bit more on that in terms of what specifically was your strategy to garner the support from the conservative and the Republican side?
One thing is, we knew that even though we have a Democratic mayor, that many Republicans voted for her. That was very helpful. The mayor has broad support among people of both parties, and that was something that was very, very helpful. So kissing up right in front of her. You know, but I think the other thing is that we talked to everybody, that we thought we had a chance with winning based on our predictive model that we put together. We didn't make assumptions based on partisanship or based on where people lived. We trusted the data, we trusted our messaging, and even if we had largely Democratic door knockers in a particular area or people who typically were used to talking to Democrats, we explained to them, you have a real meaningful opportunity here to get people who may not otherwise be on board to get on board. And so we did not do a separate mail track to Republicans and a separate mail track to Democrats. We put a message together that worked for everybody, that was about this coordinated attack, and we just didn't take any vote for granted and had as many meaningful conversations as we could. On top of that, we worked very hard to have earned media that told the story. The council members went out there and worked their butts off talking to as many people as possible. And the mayor devoted the past, couple of months to going out and talking to people who were willing to listen and trust her guidance. And I think that was just a big part of it. There's some messaging that we knew worked better than others, that is Phoenix specific. And, we can, another webinar or whatever, you can get in touch with Josh at the Center for Transportation Excellence, and maybe we could put something together to talk specifically about that, or you can contact me at Resolute. But the big picture was not to make assumptions.
So we really tried to trust our data on this campaign. I think it's valuable to do focus groups and polling to understand who are the right messengers. So if people want to hear from AARP or the Chamber of Commerce and they're with you, that is very, very valuable. You don't want to make too many assumptions. There's been a little bit of a difference in our data from the 104 campaign, which was our first, to the 105 campaign. In 104, pleasant surprise, but one that was a surprise to me, equity arguments were really important. Voters across party lines thought everyone should get their fair share and that we wanted to serve everyone. Allowing Phoenicians to age in place was one that cut across party lines. In this election, because we had outside influences with Koch brothers network affiliated individuals, that was something that also cut across party lines. The idea of people coming from outside of our community and telling us what we should be doing. We really tried to listen and learn from lessons, but both successful campaigns and then in particular Nashville. We were well aware that we were a big city coming up after Nashville did not vote in support of transportation, and a lot of the anti-transit stakeholders who were there were also pushing against our rail system in Phoenix. And Tony spoke about it, but we tried to do a lot of direct contact with voters as a result of that. So my co-chair and I tried to be out in the community as much as possible, doing town halls or even smaller conversations and really talking about what this meant for our community and for Phoenix.
And let me add one thing just sort of broadly too that I think is important, which is the operator of our transit system, Valley Metro. For you data heads, they poll very well. People like Valley Metro and they like light rail, and they like them for a reason, because in the way that they are operating the system, they're doing an excellent job, and that's something that the people who are never going to be with us, they're never going to think that. But for the most part, everybody really likes what they've done, and over the past decade, as they've been operating the system, and whether it's people, some close to 50% of people said that they've been on light rail in Phoenix at some point, even though the other campaign said only 1% ever rode it. 50% said they've been on it at some point, whether that's going to a ball game, whether that's going downtown to go to a museum with their family, or whether it's people commuting to work. And so the work that was done by Valley Metro to establish light rail as an asset to our community, particularly in the way the mayor talked about, which is spreading equity, that allowed us to not make this campaign about trying to convince people that light rail was good. And it made people very, very nervous that we were not engaging in that fight, that we were not, because the research told us not to, that we were not out there fighting back every time they said one bad thing about light rail, whatever. Instead just would say, for example, in Phoenix, people love street signs. They don't make a difference, though, by the way. So, big waste.
Street signs being the big campaign signs along the roads. Right,
which many of your towns make it illegal, and I love Phoenix, but it would be a reason for me to move. The other campaign were so confident that people dislike light rail that many of the early signs just were like, stop light rail, whereas our signs were like, protect light rail. And so we saw those go up. We were like, all right, well, I don't think signs matter, but at least that's their message. They ended up pivoting, as more of the outside, out-of-state Koch brother network started to take over the messaging, and they started talking about build better roads, that kind of stuff. But anyway, this is a long way to say great job by the people at Valley Metro and the city of Phoenix and the cities that operate that system, in sort of establishing this as an asset, so we were able to defend it, and that was crucial.
Tony and Mayor, you touched on a very important point here, and of course, a lot of our attendees here today listening to you are transit agency people, certainly, and they're thinking about their next ballot measure. What specifically might you suggest to them in terms of how they can prepare, if that's possible, as they begin contemplating entering a campaign for a ballot measure? What should they be doing as transit agencies? We know that they can't actively be out there arguing or trying to persuade for a vote, but yet their support in different ways is important. Any further comment on that from either or both of you?
One of the things that's really helped us here is that we had broad community involvement in developing our plan. We had stakeholders who were with us from very early design about what would go to the ballot, particularly with our first campaign, Prop 104. So when we had stakeholders from the Chamber of Commerce who were part of design, and again, we also started our relationship with AARP when we were designing the plan. And because they had helped us craft it, they could really speak with expertise about what was in the plan and why it mattered and why it reflected their values. So I think the early stakeholder process and meetings, we tried to do a lot of meetings throughout the community. As we developed our original plan, we had also very distinguished residents involved. Probably the best known to people on this call would be Mary Peters, who was Secretary of Transportation in the Bush administration and is originally from Arizona. So that was also key to us, to have a bipartisan nature as we developed the plan, and to really be out in the community to make sure we could say it was the community's plan. We've also tried to do a good job of telling the story of transit and what it does for people in our community, and Valley Metro has been very involved in that. What a difference it makes to the disabled veteran in a wheelchair who can get around more easily, what a difference it makes to our students who have more access to opportunity. So I would say those would be two key areas, just continuous messaging about why this matters and how it reflects the values of our community.
And I think the thing I would add to that is think about how you're talking about your systems. And if there's the ability to do research, because we had some surprising findings on our effort. And here's a classic example, which the number of people I've had this conversation with who tell me that who were like, I don't think that's right, was very high, which was that we found that messaging about economic development and job creation, especially if it's meant as a counter to cost, that does not work. And I think a lot of that's going to be very shocking to people. That it, and in fact, we found that there was the biggest blowback among Republican voters hearing that. Isn't that, you know, I worked for a mayor of Phoenix and a mayor of Tempe, both were on light rail. I've written plenty of speeches that talked about these same numbers that are in my head because, you know, I was surprised by this, and we decided to trust the data. And instead, you know, I don't want to be flippant about it because this isn't really a good message, but, you know, instead of like, well, light rail costs this much, like, oh, what creates this much development? The answer really is, well, it's worth it. That's really the answer. The answer is it's worth it because it spreads opportunity among our community and it connects people to work. It helps people improve their lives, it elevates lives, help people get to school. And to some extent, constantly messaging about development can feed into what the opposition is pivoting to about what the dangers of light rail or transit in these communities do. And that is something that, you know, same thing about messaging about like world-class cities and that kind of stuff. And, you know, obviously your communities might be different than Phoenix. But that was a big surprise that I wasn't expecting. And we, once again, decided like, let's lean into the research. Let's be disciplined about how we're talking about that. And I do think that there might be something there that's applicable in other parts of this country.
And I think transit agencies are doing great work talking to their constituents, doing regular research about what their residents think about. There's a lot of innovative work being done on social media and just monitoring what people are saying and responding to that. And that is all incredibly valuable. So would encourage people to keep up the good work in that area.
Excellent. I want to go now to questions we're getting in from our audience, and one that concerns many systems that are out there, and you all dealt with it head on, and that is the issue of opposition, the opposition you had. You mentioned the Koch brothers and the issues around that. How did you deal with issues of misinformation and countering the effects that they presented to you in the campaign?
We tried to respond as quickly as possible. There was a lot of misinformation out there. One big example was folks in the Koch brothers network were saying that it would lower your taxes if you voted the way they wanted on this, which was not the case. And just really trying to be as aggressive as we could on social media and talking to reporters and whatever way in my speeches, trying to really correct the record and make sure it was a fact-based campaign. But, was there some misinformation out there?
And then from a campaign perspective, is that we weren't afraid to throw elbows. We weren't afraid to be aggressive. And I think that might be something that people are nervous about, that we were not afraid to paint the opposition and really if they got called out for, you know, misrepresenting a fact, as happened a decent number of times on this campaign, we did our best to make them eat their misrepresentation and that they had to live with it. And we were aggressive. It was important to us to reframe who, you know, like the local narrative was that, you know, there's obviously like there are legitimate community members who oppose light rail and have concerns about it, and that's something that we all experience everywhere. But we were able to, and frankly, working with the Center for Transportation Excellence was very helpful with this. We were able to get the city to get the media to tell the story of where this really came from, and we were very, very aggressive about getting it out there. That, you know, why on earth did all of a sudden this proposition make it so that not only does it end extensions already approved by voters 3 times, but it also would put into the city constitution a ban on any fixed rail transit ever. And that was the kind of thing that, frankly, there are people who do not like light rail, and this was a message that worked with conservatives, and they would say, why would they do that? And it helped us frame the ideological reasons and the sort of outside nature of what they were doing, and it took us being aggressive and not being afraid to go after the Koch brothers, frankly.
The folks on the other side did a fair amount of bringing in DC think tanks and that type of experts, and I initially thought we needed to do the same thing. In the end, we ended up going with local voices, and I think that was also very, very valuable. People wanted to hear from their neighbors and the people in their community, whereas we had this sort of network from outside of our community that was attacking our transit system. And I think that's something that's a common experience with many of these initiatives.
Another question that's come in from the audience has to do with bus and bus rapid transit. And I know, this was all focused on light rail, but to what degree did buses and BRT and expansion of those kind of systems come into play here amongst the discussions and the campaigning?
One thing that was really gratifying to me was our whole transit community stepped up to help, even though it was only light rail on the ballot. We are in Arizona, which is one of the few states in the country that has virtually no support from our state government for our transit system. So our city and county level soon, and that will include, I hope, a robust transit component, which includes rail, bus, BRT. And so those stakeholders understood that it wasn't a zero-sum game, buses versus rail, that we rise and fall together. So our bus partners helped out with education, with fundraising, and with talking about the campaign. And I appreciate that they were able to think big picture.
I also have a great file on my computer that includes video and screenshots and cut and paste of all the times that the people who are against light rail talked about how great buses are and how great bus rapid transit would be and how great all these other opportunities are, because I wanted to capture every single one of those things, because I know that in a matter of weeks or months, they're going to be talking about how that stuff isn't important. And so I do love that many people who are not natural allies of public transit had made a decision that the best way to sort of win this is to say, you know what we need? We need more buses, and and so I legitimately have that. This is where my attention to detail and pettiness becomes a benefit to having me on. But, it did happen a lot. Like, I think there are a lot of people who, they just spent the last 2 months talking about how great buses are. And so I'm really hoping that becomes a useful part of the next effort.
When we had our Transportation 2050 campaign on the ballot, so that was our 2015 campaign, the largest expenditure was for bus service, but the debate at that time had really focused on the light rail system. That's what the opposition had taken out as the most controversial and the focus of the campaign. So even though we were spending more on bus, both in that campaign and this, light rail really has been the focus of the debate.
Another question from the audience, and it really has to do with, again, some advice perhaps that you might offer. We have communities and cities all across the country, and certainly, I'm sure, even in Arizona, that are in queue for perhaps undertaking a ballot measure. What advice would you have to other mayors that are in similar circumstances, that are wondering, how do I build support for transit in my community? What would you offer, Mayor and Tony?
And I also want to repeat my offer. Other mayors who've been here before helped me. And I actually think my involvement with the transportation campaign when I was on the city council was very helpful in getting this new job that I have. After I chaired that campaign was the first time anyone really began to suggest to me that I should think about running for mayor. But people in the community felt commitment to infrastructure was something they wanted to see from mayors. So whether your mayor is on your transit board or not, I think it is a win for the mayors to be involved. It's such a tangible way to help your city and addresses so many of the things our residents face in a daily life, and they can see quality of life improve with these changes. So it's gratifying as an elected official to be involved in changing the face of your city for the better.
Let me ask another question here from the audience that's come in, and it has to do really with how you invested the resources that you were able to raise for the campaign, and kind of where you thought it paid off for you in terms of how you deployed, the resources that you had available to you.
So we, this is a mail election. All of them are in Arizona for the most part, where voters will get their ballot about a month in advance, and they can vote up to or drop off that ballot on election day.
So when we say mail election, meaning you vote by mail with an absentee ballot.
The mayor is really good at catching all my jargon. And so we knew that mail was an important component to this campaign, and we, invested heavily in mail. The two things that we spent the most on were mail and digital advertising. And our digital advertising was 100% person to person based on our predictive model. Every single ad that was either on social almost every single ad that was either on social or was on display was targeted using our voter file and the predictive model at who it is that we wanted to talk to. And so we weren't making placement guesses based on where we thought people would go and all that kind of stuff. And that was a huge, huge part of what we did. And then the field effort was big. And basically, once we locked in our mail apparatus and our digital apparatus, any additional resources we dumped into field. And that was something that was a huge team effort. There were organizations that already were planning on going and talking to voters, maybe even some voters who typically you wouldn't target in an election like this, some low propensity voters who don't vote that often. And we pulled them in, and they devoted, their manpower and resources to talking to those voters. And we undertook a very ambitious door-to-door and some phone effort where we divided up turf among organizations, CASE, Mi Familia Vota, Our Voice, Our Vote. Those are groups that really took a big lead on that. And for context, this is an August election, and so on election day it was 110 degrees. But people were still out there talking. We also invested in text messaging that was not sort of mass text messaging, but conversational. And I think we'll put a report out about how well that worked, where we were actually really following up with everybody we had a contact with at the door. And then finally, we used we did some social pressure mail this is mainly for the hacks on the call. So we did some social pressure mail, which is a special type of mail that is intended only to get people to vote who typically don't vote, who we thought were on our side. And I think that was a big success. We were able to invest in that at the end. We made the decision to not do TV or not do radio because we felt like we had to be having conversations directly with people where they lived. I think that with additional resources, we absolutely would have done those things. But when it came time to make a decision about where to spend, that was how we broke it down. Hopefully that helps.
And I think if you are doing a campaign in November with the presidential year, you probably have to talk to a larger number of people. TV would be more important.
Big time.
We were just one city, and in an August election, so a smaller electorate thanks to our model, we had a very good idea of who was going to be voting, and so we could speak specifically to them. But if you are on the ballot next November where you have huge turnout, and also if you have more than a city voting, but maybe an entire county or region,
Yeah, you got to do TV.
then TV would be more
Yeah.
cost effective.
Yeah.
Well, Mayor and Tony, we thank you. Unfortunately, our 1 hour is up. We could easily go another hour. We maybe have to find another time perhaps to do that. Let me again just say how grateful we are for sharing your story with us and your leadership for what you've done on behalf of the residents of Phoenix and the Maricopa region and Valley. It's really pretty amazing. Before we conclude, I want to urge all of those that are tuning in today to stay connected to APTA's Center for Transportation Excellence and the resources that it has available. Please check in regularly at these web addresses, www.apta.com and www.cfte.org. A reminder, the Transit Initiatives and Communities Conference is December 15th through 17th in Tampa, Florida. Again, Mayor, we thank you. Tony, thanks very much for sharing your know-how, your expertise, and the great work that you've done. We certainly look forward to staying connected with you. And for all of you on the lines today, thanks for joining in with us. And we hope this has been a great help and advantage to you as you think through your challenges in your local cities and communities. Thank you all.